First story, The Lantern That Stayed. I took the night shift because I wanted small-town silence. Maplewood promised enough distance from other people's noise to hear my own thoughts. My name is Ethan. I moved back to the suburbs after college because my mother needed the house kept upright, and because autumn felt like a penance, I could sit inside and watch through the kitchen window. Nights here smell like damp leaves and lamp oil, and the porch lights wink on like tired constellations. I thought I knew every creak of the floorboards. I thought I could map the dark by memory. I was wrong. The first time I noticed the lantern was after a storm. I had gone out to gather shutters from the yard, hands numb, cheeks stung by wind. On Maple Hollow Lane, a lamppost burned with that soft amber everyone in town likes to call nostalgic. But at the end of the block, where the cul-de-sac dips into scrub and forgotten fences, there was a small old lantern propped on a mailbox. An old thing, brass with glass fogged at the edges. It looked impossible there, as though someone had dropped a relic from another century into our October evening. I carried it home because the town had this rule about not letting things stay where they did not belong. That night, the lantern sat on my kitchen table. I knocked it. It chimed like a throat. I told myself it was just an object, a curiosity. My mother, Grace, laughed when she saw it. "You and your treasures," she said. But when she turned off the kitchen lamp and the house went dark, the lantern did not look like a thing at all. It looked like a small heart that refused to go out. I opened it. The flame inside burned with a yellow that felt like memory. We left it there. After that, the nights shifted. People in town began to leave small lamps and candles by their doors, by their garden gates, little lights in jars on stoops. A seasonal thing, folks said, for mood. But the lights were always on, no matter how late, and sometimes, when the wind was wrong, I would walk past a neighbor's yard and see a lantern burning on the far side of the hedge where there was no path, where the grass trampled oddly as if someone had been pacing and not walking. The cats grew nervous. The dog 2 doors down howled at nothing and then stopped as if someone had told it a secret. One night, a boy from down the street, Mason, who is younger than me by a few years, rang my door. His eyes were hollow with a fear that had the neat edges of a story told too many times. "My sister's light," he said. "It won't go out." I followed him to a split level where yellowed curtains shivered. On the porch, a jar with a wick burned steady as breath. Mason tried to smother it with his jacket. It guttered and came back as if it had been inhaling the fabric. "Take it," he begged. "Take it from our house." I felt stupidly heroic and foolish both. I should have refused, but I did not. I carried the jar and told myself obligation is different than superstition. When I brought the jar to the lantern on my table, the flame inside each seemed to notice the other. They hummed, small and terrible, like insects that remembered a shape. I slept and dreamed that my childhood street stretched and folded into itself, that the maple trees in the park changed places overnight, like a shuffle of cards. I woke to find my living room window fogged on the inside with somebody's breath that did not belong to anyone living in my house. The lantern sat where it had been, glass gleaming, flame patient as a sentinel. Then the knocking began. It was soft at first. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 again, on doors all along Maple Hollow. People would open, find nobody on the step, only a leaf curled into the perfect shape of a human hand. The town started to call it the Lantern Knocks. And we laughed uneasily until Miss Dalloway across the street did not laugh anymore. Her porch lantern burned like a child's eye. She opened her door and stepped out and walked straight into the black between houses and did not come back. Her husband found her slippers by the hydrangeas, soaked with the dew of 2 nights. I kept the lantern because keeping it felt like an answer. I kept it because every time I thought to throw it into the river that traces the southern edge of town, my fingers would clench as though the glass had roots. Keeping it, I told myself, was containment. Keeping it, I told myself, made me the last guard. One evening in November, cold enough to make the air crack, the knocks came to my house. I heard them under my skin before they reached wood. 3, pause, 3. I stood at the window and watched the street. A figure stood at the curve of the road, pale as a page, and holding nothing. The hair along my arms raised. I opened the door. It smelled like old paper and rain. The figure did not walk toward me. It folded into the space between two porch lights and became something the town never named. It whispered my name, an echo of a childhood I had tried to forget. I recognized the cadence. It was the lullaby my mother used to sing the year my father left. I felt my feet move forward, as if the street had made a promise, and I had agreed. I did not remember placing the lantern in my hands. It was heavy with all the porch lights of Maplewood. The flame inside leaned toward the shape, as if it had been waiting for a face to feed. I thought to say no, to slam my door, to break the glass, to do anything that would make the world sensible again. Instead, I stepped closer, and the night ran its fingers over me. It huddled like a hungry thing. The figure smiled without moving its mouth. The sound of it was the knocks combined, the soft approval of leaves hitting window pane. I lifted the lantern, and the figure leaned its head into the light. I could not tell if it was a child or not, if it was my father or a memory pretending to be him. The flame touched the figure and did not burn. It drew instead, like a moth to a lamp will draw itself until only the dust remains. The light brightened until my eyes wanted to close. When the light went out, it left behind a silence so complete I felt it in my teeth. The figure was gone. The lantern was cold and empty, glass clear as a mirror. On the table where it had sat, a small, crumpled leaf lay. Perfect, pressed flat as if by a hand. And on the underside of the leaf, in the tiny veins, someone had written a name that I knew without having been told. I read it, and I cannot unsee the way the script moved like a finger, carving out my life. The name was my mother's. I put the leaf in my pocket and walked outside. Along Maple Hollow, the porch lights had all extinguished. In every house, a window was dark, and in every dark window, I saw my own face looking back at me. And then my own face smiled, and then the smile was not mine. Second story, when the maples whispered. I moved to Willow Ridge in early autumn because I wanted the kind of quiet that muffles your own thoughts, the kind you can hear crackle beneath the leaves. My name is Daniel Hart, and the house on Marigold Lane had a porch swing, a rusted mailbox with a crooked flag, and maples that turned the whole street into a slow-burning fire each October. At first, it felt like a small forgiveness. I had come to hide from other people's lives and the busy ache inside mine. I thought I would sleep. The first night, I woke to a sound like someone walking on dry paper beneath my window. I told myself it was the maples shedding, the neighborhood settling. I stood at the sill and peered out. A lamplight bled across the pavement, and there was no one. When I turned away, a leaf tapped the glass. A deliberate, soft knock. My throat tightened in a way I had not expected. I opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The air smelled like wood smoke and rot. There was a small stack of leaves on the edge of the walk, arranged like a letter. I bent down and found a scrap of torn fabric tucked in their center, and for a moment I thought of Claire, a name I had not spoken in months. And then I realized the fabric smelled of salt and iron, not of any person I knew. Days slipped into the kind of routine that is supposed to be healing. I mowed the unkempt lawn, fixed the stubborn sink, drank coffee on the porch while the maples shed a slow rain of gold. But the leaves began to arrive in impossible places. On my pillow, inside my shoes, folded into the pages of the library book I had borrowed from the town's small shelf. Each pile felt intentional, like punctuation. Once on a stair, I found a child's mitten that did not belong to anyone on my cul-de-sac. I asked Mrs. Keene next door, and she blinked at me as if I had asked about the weather in the dark. Maples like to leave things behind, she said. They always have. Her mouth tightened as if she were telling a joke she did not want to tell. At night, the whispering began. It started as wind, the easy excuse, but the sound braided into syllables that almost matched my name, as if the trees were practicing how to say it. I recorded the noise once on my phone, hands trembling, but the playback was only wind and rustle. Yet at 3 in the morning, my bedroom felt full of small voices, patient and patient and patient. I told myself I was exhausted. I told myself the town's quiet had seeped into me. I slept with the lamp on. One evening, while hauling a bag of yard waste to the curb, I saw footprints in the damp dirt near the old stone wall that bordered my yard. Bare, small, pressed like someone had walked there in stockinged feet. The impression led to the base of the largest maple, where the ground was hollow and dark as if something had been hollowed out and left to sleep. I knelt and my fingers brushed a carved word into the bark, shallow and old, home. My palms went cold. I had not carved it. No neighbor knew its history. Still, the trees kept watching. I started dreaming of a boy who lived here once, a boy who fell through a root and never climbed back out. In my dreams, his hair was the color of leaves and his thumb was missing. The dreams were so vivid, I woke with soil under my nails. The next morning, I found a child's thumbprint smeared on the inside of my glass, small and smudged, as if little fingers had pressed to see who I was. The town's quiet had always felt protective, but it had rules. There was a curfew that no one named. When the maples stopped gossiping and the lantern in the square guttered, you did not go outside. One night I heard laughter, thin and high, the sound of small lungs. I followed it into the yard, thinking I could find the source and end the thing that had been teaching my name. The air folded around me like paper. The maple's branches leaned, not with wind but with focus, and a path of leaves fell open at my feet, leading to the hollow under the great tree. I should have stepped back. I did not. Inside the hollow was a little trench, lined with fallen bark and a toy's wheel, pale with use. Something wet and soft pressed against my fingers. It was a letter, folded until it was thin as a blade. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a single sentence in tiny, careful writing. "We kept it safe for you." The ground hummed. The air smelled suddenly like the harbor, brine and something older. My heartbeat pounded in my ears like a drum roll. I felt the world tilt. I thought the ending would be discovery. The boy reunited with his mother, the town relieved, my life made whole. Instead, the maples had a different hunger. The voices rose, and in that chorus, I heard the names of everyone who had ever moved into Willow Ridge and then left in tears. And beneath all those names, a softer voice. My name, but reshaped. It was not calling me to be saved. It was calling me to stay. I tried to run. My legs moved, the porch light a star behind me, but the leaves were sticky like hands. They tangled around my ankles and tugged. I fought, ripping at the cling of vines woven from dead summers. The hollow answered with laughter that was not cruel, only completing a long memory. The maples folded their branches down and the world narrowed to the rustle and the scrape of bark against bone. Something pressed at the back of my skull, insistent and cool. I tasted earth. I had thought hiding would be the end of my pain, that silence could bury what made noise in me. The trees wanted silence too, but not the kind that forgets. They wanted company. They kept what arrived, and they kept the people who stayed. When they finally let me go, it was dawn. I stood at the edge of my yard, the leaves scattered like pages, my shoes full of soil, and a child's mitten folded in my palm. The town was waking as if nothing had happened. Mrs. Keene walked her dog and nodded without surprise. I walked back into my house and found on my pillow a single maple leaf, its veins like a map I did not want to read. I placed it in a jar on the windowsill where the light could pick at its edges, and I knew, with a clarity like frost, that Willow Ridge keeps what it needs. At night now, when the maples whisper, I answer. I do not always speak. Sometimes I sit very still and listen while the words shape themselves around the catalog of our little town. People move away and leave behind boxes and regrets. But the maples remember. They remember more than any of us want. And if one evening you hear someone call your name from the sidelines of the rustle, do not ignore it. Because the trees are patient, and patient is a long thing. Third story, October's Quiet Grin. I moved back to Ridgewood because the city had eaten everything soft inside me. Laughter, patience, the small courtesies, and spat me out like a stone. My sister, Claire, had a narrow house on Maple Street with a porch full of pumpkins that looked carefully offended. I told myself I had come for fresh air, for the thin consolation of rustling leaves. But the truth was quieter and meaner. I wanted to hide from faces that remembered the man I used to be. The first week was ordinary in the way a snapped twig is ordinary until the fox appears. Neighbors stacked firewood. Kids in oversized scarves rode bikes with streamers. The air in Ridgewood tasted of ovens and damp apples. Every evening, the wind moved through the maples like an audience turning its head. I started to notice, on walks that I took too late and alone, a sound beneath the usual sigh of autumn, like paper being folded, like someone whispering a list of names that never belonged together. I told myself it was the wind, or my mind trying to stitch meaning onto empty fabric. Then Ethan disappeared. Ethan lived 3 houses down from Claire. He had a laugh like he wanted to trade jokes for friends and always wore the same patched denim jacket. One morning, his porch was empty, and his bicycle lay on its side like a thing that had fallen asleep mid-ride. People murmured. Someone said he had left for the city. Someone else said he had taken his truck and would be back by dinner. None of it fit the gap he left. His coffee cup gone. His dog whining at the window until Claire wrapped her arms around the creature and promised that everything would be all right. But evenings became sharper after Ethan. Like someone's breath close to your ear. On the 7th night after Ethan vanished, I walked past the orchard behind Ridgewood Elementary. Hallie apples swelled on low branches. The moon made them look like eyes. The orchard had a narrow path where the town kids built forts in summer. I found a small circle of crushed leaves in the dirt, and in the center a scrap of paper folded into the shape of a grin. It was not a smile anyone had traced with kindness. The corners were edged with the color of old rust. When I picked it up, the paper made a sound like a voice clearing its throat. I began hearing names with more clarity. Small syllables braided into the rustle of every fallen leaf. Not a list, but a conversation, soft and patient, as if the tree itself had learned a lullaby it would not forget. My own name threaded through them sometimes. And when that happened, I would stop dead. Heart slamming like a bird against glass. I tried to leave. I offered Claire whatever excuse sounded neat enough. A job, a trip, a medical appointment I had not booked. But weeks drifted into the fine gray of October, and each time I packed a bag, my keys would not find the right pocket, or my phone would ring with only the wind on the other end. Ridgewood held me with ordinary gravity. Its small rituals bent me into staying. At night, I dreamt of people with mouths full of leaves, of faces unbuttoning and spilling out yellow and auburn. I woke to the sound of someone outside my window, whispering something like my childhood nickname. The whisper knew the exact place in my chest where the shame lived. I kept a notebook on the kitchen table and tried to be rational. I wrote the names I heard. Ethan, Mrs. Patel from the corner bakery, a boy I recognized from the bus stop. I wrote them down the way you might press a leaf between pages. Careful, thinking it would preserve what it was supposed to be. The more I wrote, the clearer the pattern became. The names were not being taken at random. They belonged to people who had once stood under the orchard in autumn and laughed at something they should not have laughed at. An accident, a cruelty, an omission thrown into the wind. Ridgewood, it seemed, kept a slow ledger. One night I found the house lights on across the way. Mrs. Patel's kitchen glowed like an apology. Through her window, I saw the old woman stand very still, the paper grin held like an offering in her hands. She had a leaf caught in the collar of her cardigan. For a moment, she looked at me with a face that was all quiet resignation. And then she folded the paper and placed it on the sill, and the leaf spread like a mouth. I wanted to warn Claire. I wanted to steal her car keys and drive until the asphalt dissolved into something nameless. Instead, I sat at the table and watched the pages of my notebook fill like small graves. My hands shook. The names multiplied. My breath became a thing I could feel draining out of me in small domestic increments. The kettle's whistle, a door closing too softly, the tick of the hall clock. Fear, when it is accustomed, stops being an emotion and becomes furniture. The night it took Ethan's dog, I heard the barking start, then stop, then rise into something that sounded like laughter. I ran out in my socks, the cold stabbing the soles of my feet. The dog stood at the edge of the orchard and looked at me with eyes that had no pupil at all. only a ring of pale leaf veins. Its collar dangled a scrap of paper that fluttered and hated being still. I reached for it, and the dog opened its mouth and did not bark so much as exhale a word. My name. It sounded like the name belonged to someone behind glass. I know what you want to do when you encounter an ancient thing. Say its name. Turn it toward the light. Make a plan. I tried. I made lists. I set a camera on Claire's porch and recorded long, dull hours of empty street. The footage showed only leaves and the occasional car, but once, in the space between 1 minute and the next, the frame caught a movement too human for comfort, a shadow that bent like a person and folded something into the wind. The last time I walked into the orchard, I went because I thought I could bargain. I went because men in stories often go where they should not, and sometimes they return. The air smelled like kerosene and old apologies. The path opened into a hollow ringed with maple trunks. Leaves lay like 100 small hands. In the center, a thing sat on the dirt, a lantern, old and pitted, its glass filled with the color of October. When I stepped closer, I saw the grin, no longer paper, but a ripple in the light, cutting the lantern's face. It watched me as if it had been waiting for someone to notice. "You're not taking us," I said. My voice sounded small and polite, like a guest asking to be excused. The lantern tilted. The grin widened. In the same instant, I understood the economy of this place. It did not want bodies. It wanted the sound of you being certain of your small, safe little life. It wanted the ordinary narratives we tell ourselves, broken down until only the name remained. I should have run. Instead, I remembered Ethan's laugh, and the dog with its leaf veins, and the coffee cup on the porch. I remembered the small ways people had swallowed each other's sorrows and called them charity. I saw the ledger and realized I had been keeping it all along, with my quiet, small cruelties. Shame is a neat fuel. Take me, I whispered. My voice cracked with something like relief and terror braided together. The grin bent toward me, patient and satisfied. The leaves rose in a careless gust and circled my knees. For a moment, my name seemed to leave my throat of its own accord and went into the air like smoke. I do not know how long I stood there. Memory thins at the edges where things become myth. When I blinked, my hands were full of paper folded into impossible smiles. They fit together like a body, lip to lip, crease to crease. And when I tried to speak, there was only the rustle of leaves where my voice had been. The next morning, on Claire's porch, someone posted a note. "If you see me, tell me my name." It read in careful block letters. Neighbors nodded as if this made sense. I watched them from behind a window I had not known I could see through. Their mouths moved. Their faces worked like people rehearsing for a play where everyone had forgotten their lines. The world kept turning its small, low-key rot. Sometimes at dusk, I pass the orchard and stand at the edge and listen. The trees speak in the language of small predations. Names folded into leaves, names carried like seeds. If you listen long enough, you might hear me in the rustle, trying to say something that is not a name anymore. But names are what grew here. Names are what the grin liked best. And now, when the wind lifts in Ridgewood and October presses its teeth into the last of the year, a new sound curls through the maples, a voice that is almost me, counting the people I loved and the things I did not say aloud. It sounds patient. It sounds inevitable. It sounds like a grin. Fourth story, the October knot of Harrow Hollow. I moved back to Harrow Hollow because fall felt like a promise I could still keep. Crisp air, a porch that creaked in familiar ways, maple leaves that burned orange and then bled brown. My name is Daniel Miller, and I told myself I was running toward quiet. But quiet does not shake hands with the past. The first night, the breeze smelled like burnt sugar and old paper, and I found a folded scrap of paper tucked under a loose shingle on the porch. A child's careful scrawl. "Come home," it read. I laughed, because laughter is softer than admitting you are afraid, and I tucked the note into my coat pocket as if hiding it from myself. Days unspooled like old film. I walked the same lane each evening, Oak Street, then past the rusted mailbox that still bore Mrs. Carter's name, then down to the small park where the Ferris wheel had once spun every autumn fair. The town smelled of cider and wood smoke, and neighbors waved with gloves on. Everything looked like a postcard. Everything hid a thread. On the third night, the lights in half the houses went out at once. Not from a storm, but from something deliberate. Lamps snuffed like candles. I stood on my porch and watched ribbons of darkness crawl across the town, swallowing porches, swallowing the hollow in the hill. A dog barked once, but it did not run. Silence came with teeth. I heard footsteps, too many, slow and soft, beneath the maple trees lining the road, and then a voice. A chorus, really, low and patient, as if the wind had learned to speak in people's names. It called nothing so much as invitation. I followed the sound, because curiosity is a cheap dare, and I found the hollow, an old, forgotten lot where pumpkins had been left to rot last season. Something, had tied lengths of twine between the trees, weaving a web of knots that glinted in the moonlight. Each knot had a name tag, faded strips of cloth with names I recognized. Children who had moved away, a lover who drowned in a river 2 winters ago, my father's name scribbled on a narrow scrap that made my hands go cold. I did not remember leaving his name there. He was long dead, but there it was, wrapped into the October knot, as if the town had been stitching people back into itself. I wanted to run. I wanted to tear every knot and fold the world back into order. Instead, I reached out, fingers brushing one name, my own, and the twine hummed under my touch, like a chord struck in an instrument I had never heard but somehow knew the melody to. The knot tightened. The air smelled suddenly of iron and rain. I heard behind me, footsteps stepping into formation. Not walking, but arranging themselves like pages being turned. "Do not look away," said the hush. "Do not break the pattern." I woke up on my porch at dawn, dew on my shoes, an ache at the back of my skull. The scrap of paper was gone. My pocket was empty. At noon, Mrs. Carter crossed the street and asked if I had seen her grandson, Ethan, lately. He had been at the fairground, she said, but then he wasn't. Her voice folded like paper, and I watched her fingers knot and unknot as if remembering how to tie shoelaces. I told her I had not seen him. She stared at me as if I had answered wrong. The word hollow sat on my tongue and would not leave. That night the names multiplied. Twine threaded itself across windowsills. Ribbons began appearing on mailboxes, on lampposts, on the swings in the park. Each knot held a small token, a toy, a photograph, a button. Each token was warm to the touch. I found, tied behind my shed, a woman's locket that my brother had once promised to give to their mother. My hands trembled until the metal felt like a brand. The town began to keep time by the knots. People walked differently, heads bowed, hands busy with unseen work. Smiles were thin and careful. Children learned the names of knots like prayers. I went to the mayor in the morning, hoping for electricity, for logic. He drank coffee and did not meet my eyes. He told me of an old harvest custom, a binding of sorts, something about the soil remembering, about debts. He said it as if rehearsed. He said, "We knot ourselves to keep the hollow from eating the roads." He said it as if telling a bedtime story to a child who needed to sleep. I left with his words lined like stitches under my skin. That night, the knots began to tighten of their own accord. They pulled at doors, at curtains, at the hems of coats. People woke with thread marks on their wrists, as if they had been sewing in their sleep. I lay in bed listening to the town breathe, trying to tell myself it would pass. Then I heard it, chanting, low and inevitable, a neighbor's voice blending into another's until names were no longer separate. They were a single pattern. The knots wanted rehearsal. The knots wanted more names. I cut one at midnight, hands clumsy and sweating. It unraveled in my palms and spilled a smell like root cellars and old stories. I thought I had freed a scrap of life. Instead, the air around me collapsed inward. The house shivered. In the morning, my door had a new tag on it, Daniel Miller, with my handwriting, neat and small, and beneath it, a photograph of me, an ordinary photo. Only my eyes were wrong. My pupils had the peculiar flatness of photographs that had been developed twice. Panic moved through the town like smoke. I saw neighbors searching trunks and attics, cutting twine with scissors, burning handfuls of ribbon in backyards. For hours, nothing happened. Then the hollow took a child. It happened so quietly, it could have been a bad dream. A name tag fluttered from the knot and drifted into the air like a leaf. A wind rose that no one felt. A small shoe left on the porch step, its laces undone. We all heard the child laugh once, far away, and then silence. People gathered and wept with hands clenched as if holding seeds. Some said the hollow had taken what was owed. Some said the hollow finally wanted its own. I kept cutting. I moved through the streets like a mad tailor, snipping knot after knot until my hands were raw and my fingers were thin as thread. Each knot I undid stitched another sorrow in me. Each name I freed seemed to find a place inside my chest and settle. I thought of my father, how he used to hum to himself while mowing the lawn, and of the scrap of paper I had found, and of how guilt can be folded into the smallest creases. I thought I could sew the town back together by undoing what had been done. On the final night, I climbed to the hollow with a blade and a resolve like a hammer. The knot was a cathedral of twine, higher than memory, woven across branches and strung from house to house. At its center hung a blank tag, fluttering, waiting. I reached for it, my fingers shaking, and as I cut the last strand, the air inhaled and the hollow spoke. It said my name, and it said my father's, and every name it had ever learned, and it taught me the pattern. We are the place between names. We remember those who would not return. We braid the lost into the living. The words were not cruel. They were cold and patient. They said, "Do not leave the knot undone again." I wanted to ask who had started it, to point a trembling finger at a beginning. But there was no beginning. There was only the loop and the loop and the knot that closed when my hands let go. In the morning, the town was quiet as a kept secret. People walked with new stitches in their sleeves. They nodded at each other with faces that seemed older. On my porch sat a wrapped bundle, tied with twine. Inside was the locket I had found days before, and under it, a photograph from my childhood. My father smiling at me in a field of October weeds. He looked alive. My chest unclipped with a sound like a hinge. I looked for the tag, for my name. There, tucked beneath the locket, a new scrap read, "Thank you," it said. "Come home." I should have left. I should have taken the road out past the old mill and never looked back. But the hollow hungered for belonging, and belonging tastes like warmth. I placed the locket against my heart. I felt, faintly at first, a pull at my wrist, like the tug of a hand taking yours in the dark to keep you from falling. I smiled because I was tired, because the town had offered me what I had been trying to buy for years: absolution. When they found me, weeks later, they found me folded small as a scrap, asleep beneath the maples, a name tag tied neatly to my collar. The photograph on my chest had my father in it, and he was smiling as if come back for a visit. They wrapped me in blankets and said prayers. They bound a new knot in my honor on the hollow's outermost branch and left it swinging in the wind. I remember, in the fragment of a mind that remains, thinking, I gave myself to the thing I loved. I remember thinking, this is what home costs. And then the world narrowed to the point of a seam and the knot closed. Fifth story. The orchard that remembered. I moved back to Ashwood because I told myself I needed quiet, because the city had carved too many restless nights out of me. The house on Willow Lane came with a sagging porch and a backyard that ran into an old orchard. Rows of maples and apple trees that looked like tired soldiers. The town called it Hollowford now, but the old sign at the county line still read Maple Hollow. And sometimes, in the thin light of an autumn afternoon, the name felt truer than the new one. I took evenings to walk the paths between the trees. The air tasted like rust and candle smoke. Children's laughter came from the main road in the distance, muffled and ordinary. My nights, at first, felt ordinary too, until the apples started appearing. They were never there in the morning. I would wake, make coffee, and push open the back door to find a single apple laid at the foot of my porch step or on the kitchen table. Polished as if someone had taken care to buff away every bruise. Not one fell from the trees. Not one. The first time I thought a neighbor had a prankster's fancy. The second time I thought I was losing my mind. By the third, I stopped calling myself anything at all. Ethan from 2 houses down waved like he knew nothing. Claire from the bookshop said, "Old orchards keep secrets," like it was a comfort. but secret has a weight that a sentence can't carry. The apples began to change. At first, they were the plain sweet kind, but then I found one with skin bruised in the shape of a thumbprint. Another had a smear of dirt that, when rubbed, traced the shape of a face. A face small and patient. I stopped sleeping. The orchard would hum at the edge of my hearing, a low, steady sound like someone whispering names into the soil. Once I followed it. Moonlight walked the trunks in long fingers. The path crunched. The apples glowed faintly like drowning lamps. I heard my name. Soft and crooked, carried on the wind between the branches. I answered. My voice felt foreign. "Who's there?" I asked. And a breeze arranged the leaves into an old, broken laugh. The next morning, there were footprints leading from the porch into the orchard. They were human steps. Small, closer together than an adult's, the toes splayed like someone learning to balance. They went all the way to the oldest tree, the one the townsfolk called the Watcher. I had never been close enough to touch its bark without feeling like I was crossing a line. That night I crossed it. I pressed my palm to the trunk and the tree answered by exhaling a scent. Apples and salt and something older. The faint aftertaste of a name. It was like an animal recognizing its keeper. Images rose in my head. A child with a scraped knee, a woman with a shawl tied too tight, a soldier leaving on a train. They were not my memories, but they lodged in me as if they had been waiting for a place to catch. I stumbled back, heart pounding, dizzy with other people's grief. Then the voice spoke clear. It was not a whisper anymore. It was a declaration. "Remember," it said, and I remembered. I remembered the year the frost came early and took the harvest. I remembered lanterns at the edge of the orchard and the way the townsfolk carried names like stones for a bridge. I remembered a rift, something unspoken that split the town in two. Someone accused, someone hidden, someone's child gone. The orchard had watched it all and kept tally in its roots. It cataloged sorrow like apples, stacking them, polishing them, offering them back until someone would listen. I thought I would leave. I thought I could ignore a tree that dug into memory and left me hollow. But that night, a child's laughter curled around the porch, and the apple on my step had a small, neat carved initial. I knew the initial. I knew the face that matched the smear of dirt. My stomach folded into a letter I could not read. I began to dig, not in an instant of heroism. I dug slowly, politely, like I was uncovering a buried recipe. Each shovel of soil revealed shards, a ribbon, a tin whistle, a ribboned shoe button. Names rose, whispered and raw. Names of people the town pretended had left by accident, or by choice, or by misfortune. The orchard wanted its inventory returned to speech. They came while I dug. Neighbors who had once smiled across hedges stood in a ring as if at a grave. Ethan cried without sound. Claire pressed her palms together and mouthed apologies. The Watcher shed leaves like shedding skin. The apples in their hands split open and somehow showed small, impossible scenes. A child's last day in the swing light. A mother kneeling at a kitchen floor. A promise that wasn't kept. We could have stopped then. We could have closed our eyes and let the orchard keep remembering. But memory insists on being honored. We spoke names aloud, clumsy and bawling, and each name seemed to ease something in the roots. At dawn, we found the hollow under the oldest tree. It was shallow, like something someone had tried to hide without hope. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, small and light as regret. When we unwrapped it, there was nothing left but a scrap of cloth and a pebble, and a single apple seed. The seed looked like a heart. I took it into my hand, feeling the orchard's quiet press against my palm. "What do you want?" I asked. The town waited. The apple seed sat warm, not from sun, but from attention. "Plant me," the orchard seemed to say in the old language of roots. We planted the seed under the Watcher at midday, and the town watched like an audience at a confession. Rain came like applause. The seed split overnight. A sapling pushed up with leaves the color of pennies. It grew with an urgency that made the air tremble. By the time the bells from the church tolled for evening, the sapling bore a single apple. Small as a coin and fierce as truth. I held it. I smelled the whole history of Hollowford. I smelled forgiveness and the cost of naming things correctly. I bit. The taste was bright and terrible and honest. It filled my mouth with an image, a child running back toward a house, a hand reaching for a sleeve, a promise made and kept. Tears fell without shame. The next morning, the apples stopped appearing on my porch. The orchard exhaled its burden like a sleep ending. People began to speak in ways they had avoided for years. We buried the tiny remains of what had been lost, and strangely, some of the weight lifted. But on cold nights, when the wind runs lean and the maples clap like dry hands, I still hear names. I still wake to the scent of apples. And sometimes I find a single seed on my windowsill. I keep it in a glass jar. I tell myself it is only memory tending to itself. I tell myself that, but at the edge of the orchard, a new tree is growing, and it knows my name.